Call of Cthulhu is a TTRPG celebrating the stories, mythos, and style of American author H.P. Lovecraft, the pioneer of cosmic horror. While I've read some of Lovecraft's original stories, including The Call of Cthulhu, up until recently, I haven't really had any exposure to the TTRPG outside of what some other game masters have told me. And that's what's made me a little hesitant to try diving into it myself. First, I haven't ever had a game master offer to run it for me. And second, from what I've been told, there are two ideas that the system pushes that to me seem a little paradoxical in nature. First, I've been told that the system encourages deep player investment in their characters, but also that characters are fragile and can die suddenly at any time. Given how rare it is for my playgroup to find the time to actually play any TTRPG together, the last thing I would want is to waste their time by getting them really excited and invested in a character that I suddenly kill randomly throughout a session. Of course, this concern is alleviated with the solo prose gaming approach that I detailed in my videos on journal gaming and Distal. And so, I've finally dug my tentacles into Call of Cthulhu and unearthed some insights that helped me reconcile how these two seemingly paradoxical elements work well together. Hi, I'm John, this is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today, we're reviewing my first experiences with Call of Cthulhu, the TTRPG love letter to H.P. Lovecraft. Let's get into it. Okay, right up front, I do want to offer a content warning when it comes to Call of Cthulhu. First, this is a cosmic horror game, a subgenre of horror that generates dread by demonstrating humanity's cosmic insignificance. Lovecraftian stories often feature these alien, super powerful entities that can wipe out humanity as casually as we wipe out germs when we wash our hands, with the only difference being that we actually acknowledge there are germs on our hands. That being said, a common plot element in Lovecraftian literature is how the human mind buckles with the mere knowledge that these entities exist. And so, if you're sensitive about content regarding mental health struggles, this may not be the game for you. In fact, I've had a few individuals over the years express discomfort at gamifying sanity, which is a kind of hit point resource that diminishes over the course of a campaign. Having now played the system for myself, I personally feel that sanity is just a mechanic that acts as a role-playing prompt to help you as the player convey your character's fear. And I can also see how some groups may use this mechanic inappropriately to make light of real-world mental health struggles. So all in all, be the guardian to your own mind, and if you find this kind of content upsetting, just don't play it. Another disclaimer, Lovecraft was a product of his time and upbringing, which is a diplomatic way of saying, first of all, he treats mental health with all of the delicacy of a sledgehammer, and second, there is a lot of blatantly racist content in his original writings, including The Call of Cthulhu, which shares a name with the system that we're talking about today. I guess if anything, if you're prepping for a game, either as a keeper or as a player, it's just something that's good to have a heads up about when you're reading the source material. In addition, the default time period to this game is the 1920s, also the time period that resulted in a lot of Lovecraft's problematic beliefs. So during a session 0 or preliminary conversations, I think it would behoove groups to at least discuss the historical context for which the game takes place. So that way, if there are any topics that need to be avoided, it can be done so upfront. Or if there are any topics that your group is interested in exploring, well, now at least you're setting the expectations. Okay, content disclaimers out of the way. Now let's get into some disclaimers regarding my game experience with the system. First up, I am a Call of Cthulhu noob, which I think can be a helpful perspective for anyone else that doesn't have any experience with the system, wondering if it's one that would be good for them. Sometimes veterans of a system can get so lost into the weeds or so excited about certain parts of the game, they lose sight of what it's like to be a beginner. Now, I also didn't play the game the way it was intended. I didn't have a group of people I was playing with or another keeper running the game for me. Essentially, I was both the keeper and the player. In addition, although I have a lot of 7th edition Call of Cthulhu resources, including the Keeper's rulebook acquired through a Humble Bundle, the only resource I pretty much used throughout my game was whatever was in the Quick Start Rules PDF you can get right from Chaosium's website for free, linked in the description below. My main goal for the playtest was to really investigate these paradoxical expectations that other game masters conversed with me about, being that the system encourages deep player investment, and characters can die at any time, which, from my experience running games for the past decade, usually if a player expects their character to die, they tend to not really want to invest in them as a way of emotionally protecting themselves. And this was echoed about Call of Cthulhu by Brennan Lee Mulligan, who said every time he basically plays this system, everyone kind of creates these goofy characters because they know that they are probably going to bite it. That being said, I did find that these two paradoxical elements really did kind of work well together, and I'll explain why toward the end of the video. And even though it seemed kind of hypocritical to do so, I didn't end up creating my own investigator. I played the scenario using 2 of the pre-made investigators at the back of the rules document, and honestly only really focused on one of them, with having the second one come in as backup during the story's climax. Now, curiously, even though I assume this scenario was balanced for 4 player characters, given that there are 4 pre-made characters at the end of the doc, I really couldn't find anything within the Quick Start rules that referenced any sort of recommended keeper to player ratio. And thankfully, I didn't really seem to need more than the investigators I played with, which is kind of nice. It means that you don't need a big group to play. Unlike something like Dungeons & Dragons, which have different roles for a party to fill, Call of Cthulhu seems like it would be fun even with 1 player and 1 keeper, or even as a solo prose game like the way I did it. Also, like with Distal, I posted the story generated from my gameplay over on my Substack, also linked in the description. Alright, I think I've done enough disclaimers. Let's actually dive into the nitty-gritty of the game's system. Call of Cthulhu uses the basic role-playing D100 system, which apparently is a common system used across a lot of different TTRPG products produced by Chaosium. Basically, on your character sheet, pretty much any role has a value of 1 to 100. When a keeper, the game's term for a GM, asks for a roll, you roll 2 d10s, using one as the tens place and the other as the unit place, and compare them to the value. If you're equal to or under that value, you succeed. For example, my investigator has a fast talk of 60, meaning they have a 60% chance to succeed. That being said, there are degrees of success based on the role's challenge. Let's say normally my investigator's fast talk is 60, but instead they're trying to fast talk a police officer. A keeper may determine that's a hard challenge, meaning I have to roll under or equal to half of my normal fast talk in order to succeed. And if it's an extreme challenge, it's 1/5. This especially comes up in combat where there are a lot of contested rolls, and to see who comes out on top of a roll, you compare the degrees of success. So, for example, my investigator tried to fend off a knife attack, and so on his dodge roll, he got a hard success, while the knife attack only had a regular success, meaning he was able to dodge the knife. There's also a kind of advantage-disadvantage system for anyone familiar with 5th edition D&D, where if there are specific circumstances, you may roll 2 of the tens place dice, taking the lower one on a bonus or the higher one on a penalty. This came up in my game when my investigator broke his dominant side arm, and so when he tried to shoot something with his revolver, and degrees of success already mattered in a contested roll, I just had him roll a penalty die, which ended up causing him to miss. I'm not sure I'd ultimately go so far as to call Call of Cthulhu a rules-light game, but it definitely is intuitive once you get the hang of it, and the die resolutions are really snappy since you know what a success is based on what's written on your character sheet. Before I forget, there is one last rolling mechanic, which is there are times where you can try to push a roll if you failed. Basically, you get to attempt the roll again, and if you fail a second time, the narrative consequence is even worse. In my playthrough, I never needed to push a roll, but it is a cool mechanic that can come up, especially if you're in a dire situation where the consequence of failure is bad enough already. Like D&D, character health is also represented by hit points, and based on the amount of damage that your investigators can get, you really don't have a lot of hit points. My investigators started the scenario with 12, and the first time they took damage, they took 8, which is how they ended up breaking their arm. They took a major wound. Now, I could also see how sudden death is possible. At the point that he took damage, there was an earlier instance in the story where if he had failed a roll, he could have taken even more damage, enough to actually kill him. But there were also plenty of opportunities to avoid damage. So yes, the game can be deadly, but I don't think it's the meat grinder that I expected it to be based on the conversations I had with other GMs. Now, this next part, I don't really consider mechanical, but I do consider part of the game system. In the Keeper's Rulebook, I did skim through the background section, and like Distal, I think it was really strong for creating a lot of role-playing hooks for your character without being so dense that it felt like I was being boxed in on who my character was. If anything, it gave them just more of a three-dimensional personality that, for people interested in the role-playing part of the game, I can see how they would get invested in their character. But not invested in the same way as, say, the players and characters of something like Critical Role, where the players are experiencing a lot of the same emotional reality as their characters in the game. In fact, as preliminary research before playing the system, I watched this interview with the game's creative director, Mike Mason, where he explained the fun of the game isn't getting scared yourself, but rather, as a player, enjoying watching your character become frightened, like you're watching a character in a movie or a video game. And while I do think there's some possibility for some overlap, if a character suddenly dies, I don't think it would ruin a player's day. I think all in all, one of my takeaways from playtesting this system is that the game is just a little more open-ended than I initially believed. Again, based on the conversations I had, it felt like the game was deadlier than my actual experience with it, and also, there was a lot more that went into creating a character's backstory than what the actual process ended up being. I think a lot of the deep character investment was more personal than something the system demanded of players. That being said, I can see a lot of potential dissatisfaction or frustration within a group where there is a disagreement on players' investment in their characters. I know some players that would probably go more the Brennan Lee Mulligan route and create someone a little bit more cartoonish, whereas I definitely know more theater kid players that would get really involved into the mentality of their characters. I think either are okay, but unlike D&D, where it has less of a committed approach, I think it would be harder for those two types of players to play together at the same table. And so, as a potential keeper, something to keep in mind is you're probably going to need to vet your players a little more finely than you would in something like Dungeons and Dragons. Overall, though, I really like this system. I think it's intuitive for players of any mechanical skill level. Veterans can enjoy it just as much as beginners, but I also think that due to the kind of content the stories have, the group's enjoyment is going to be tied more to their social contract than necessarily the game's system. Now for this next section, I'm going to get into more details about The Haunting, which is the scenario in the Quick Start rules. If you don't want any of that story spoiled for you, you can just skip ahead to the time code on the screen right now. But I do think that if you listen to this part, it's going to give some context for my concluding thoughts at the end. The Haunting is a really quick scenario in the greater scheme of things. It definitely serves its function as a type of lick the spoon experience for the system overall. I'd like to reiterate, this is my only experience with Call of Cthulhu so far, and I played it in a way that I don't think it was intended to be played, but still, I feel like I got a really good idea of the system's strengths and maybe some things to be aware of before you start playing. The scenario revolves around a house in 1920s Boston that is supposedly haunted by its original owner, Walter Corbett. The most recent tenants, the Macario family, have already been scared away, and because of rumors surrounding the property, the landlord hires the player characters, in this case my one investigator, to prove that the house isn't haunted so he can rent the property again. I found that the scenario really unfolded over two parts. First was the preliminary investigation into Walter Corbett and some of his sinister hobbies, and second was the exploration of the house itself. These stages took about an equal amount of time, and to start, I really loved the preliminary investigation part. I think it was a cool, slow burn that planted the seeds of the supernatural goings-on within the house, which was extra fun to roleplay because my character was a skeptic of the supernatural. That being said, I was a little let down by the haunted house itself. Really, the location had 4 dangerous things in it. First was the bed frame that damaged my investigator. It floated and knocked him out a second-story window, which almost killed him by itself. Second was this magical knife that was tied to Corbett's spirit, where if the investigators went in the basement, it could float out of this pile of trash and try to poke one of them. Third was this swarm of rats hiding in the walls. So if the player characters realized that there was this secret room that Corbett's body was in, they had the chance of having the swarm of rats attack them and damage them. And then lastly, there is this kind of boss fight with Corbett himself, who kind of reanimates his own corpse. At least that was the way I interpreted it. But the thing that kind of took me out of it was a very specific detail that if the players are able to damage Corbett with his own magic knife, he's instantly defeated and disintegrates on the spot. Now, one could say that I had this mystery spoiled for me because I was both my own keeper and player. However, it just didn't feel Lovecraftian in tone. Cosmic horror is all about humans discovering that there's a lot more out there and their psyche crumbling from that knowledge. It's not so much that my investigators won the final battle, as much as the tone that their victory had. To compare it to a Lovecraft story where the heroes also win, the Dunwich Horror, yes, the heroes end up being able to use spells to defeat the bad guy in the end. However, even with his defeat, the players are haunted by the knowledge that he was just one little droplet of this greater alien entity that could just wipe them out in a second. So yes, they won the battle, but they left changed and disturbed. And even in the Call of Cthulhu, the way Cthulhu was unlocked was by complete random coincidence. As if to say, Cthulhu's cult didn't actually matter in whether or not Cthulhu would get awakened, which then kind of steals the agency of the characters in Lovecraftian work, which is kind of the tone that the author was trying to set. So to have Corbett be vulnerable and instantly defeated by his own weapon, the ending had this kind of poetic justice about it that I don't think Lovecraftian works ever had. Don't get me wrong, I had a lot of fun with the system, I had a lot of fun with the story, and it just felt more like an episode of Supernatural than it did a truly Lovecraftian cosmic horror. Now I gotta say, I am surprised by my own feelings on the matter, considering I tend to like stories where heroes are able to overcome some sort of villainy. But all in all, that just goes to show the power of expectations and how disappointment is often just generated by those expectations not really being met. So my biggest takeaway from this whole experience is that if you want an informed opinion on a game, you actually have to play the game. Not that I would say I have an informed opinion based on my small experience here, but by actually playing Call of Cthulhu, I actually had a much better understanding of all of the moving parts. If we were to reconcile this paradox, which after playing the game isn't really a paradox at all, really my misunderstanding came about from excited, hyperbolic explanations of what the system offered. Yes, the system does offer some great role-playing hooks. However, it doesn't demand that you get really invested in your character. You're certainly welcome to, but I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say it's a requirement to enjoy the game. On the other hand, yes, characters are fragile. I can see how if my investigator was met by some sort of Lovecraftian monster, they would probably die. However, if the haunting is a representative scenario of what Call of Cthulhu has to offer, the thing I noticed was the rhythm of danger. All in all, there were 5 opportunities for my character to get hurt, and I would have had to roll really badly for them to die earlier in the adventure. For the most part, there was one threat kinda early on, one threat about halfway through, everything else was right at the very end. So, if you're playing through a mystery, your investigators are, from my experience anyway, most likely to be investigating during the earlier parts and slowly uncovering what's happening, and the true threat of them dying would be toward the end. So it's not like a player is going to get really invested in their character, have their character die, and then have nothing to do for the rest of a session. That being said, if you're curious about Call of Cthulhu and don't have any experience with it yet, I would say this game is really enjoyable. If your players are okay with their characters dying, if they're fans of Lovecraftian horror and understand everything that comes with it, and have players that are respectful enough to honor the boundaries of other players at the table. If you have any potential players that are uncomfortable with the sanity mechanic, really want to see their characters live until the end, or even just want a game that's a little crunchier, Call of Cthulhu is probably one that you can pass on. So now I want to hear what all of you have to say. Does my experience sound representative of a Call of Cthulhu game, or are there major things that I'm missing? If you've played it through before, what do you think of the Call of Cthulhu Quick Start scenario, The Haunting? And for those that may have played more than just this edition, are there any design or lore elements that were included in past editions that were lost in the conversion to 7th? Let me know in the comments down below. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.